Hello everyone, today we look at the Persian cycle in Indo-European history. I made some videos about different peoples across the eras and their essentially capacity of rebooting a traditional power, divinely inspired through the essentially Iranian and virile inspiration of the probably the highest mode of the ancient divine tradition collected by the Indo-Europeans or maintained by the Indo-Europeans to a degree. We'll make more videos about the origins of all that from a historical, a religious point of view, because naturally whenever we get back in time, like in the millennia before Christ, we can naturally through different peoples carrying out a comparative study, analysis of these people's religions, spirituality, beliefs, but we always lack the sort of most definitive tale about the origins of this all, because all these myths fundamentally point to a fall from divinity, and the attempt, let's say, of those who are sort of intrigued in these ideas is realizing what are, if you want, also from an unavoidably spoiled, so kind of modern secular conception, when or how, right? You could say that the myth in and of itself is speaking of another dimension that would have thus to have occurred in the history of the world. That's why these tales are, our tales, our YouTube videos here are fundamentally just observing a certain temper and a certain content of these ideas, but still do not analyze the previous part that requires, if anything, some broader methodological inspiration, which can never be definitive, by the way. We're talking about Persia, right? The ancient Iranian tradition. Today we could speak also of a broader sort of eastern branch of Indo-European religions. We've already seen the Vedas, and as you know, I'm making more videos about not just compared Indo-European languages and mythology, because essentially as we've seen, their phonology is mirroring veritable cosmological doctrine about the world, about the essence of everything in practice. But we have, in fact, sort of try to approach Indo-European religion as a whole as well. It's important to look at the various branches, even more in depth, look at the various languages, the various root etymologies and so on, but also to argument things a bit from a historical point of view. I noticed, by the way, that these videos are more watched than the others. At the same time, they're often misunderstood. They haven't, I think, attracted too much attention outside of here, but I wouldn't be surprised. Is of course, like as most of my work, even though never discussed in the merit of its historical accuracy. Also because, as far as that is concerned, there is really, again, hardly something that I present in a way that, say, while being debatable, isn't grounded properly on actual evidence and actual scientific studies. Today we look at this branch that we sort of neglected for a while. Many of you have asked me, why don't you talk about the Iranian tradition, with which we could say Iranic to a degree, but it's just like the Germanic. There's still people saying, but the Germans don't exist back in say, conventional academic lexicology, like the term is okay, just like saying Turk, not Turkic. It's not like we're talking about modern nationality per se, but we understand each other and what this is. And I say this for Persia in particular because, as I was saying, and as we've seen also in other videos that I make about Iranian peoples, such as the sagas and so on, there is a very interesting sort of bridge position, so to say, of this people between the broader East and the West. We will make probably more videos about the Achaemenids as such, but there is probably a step dimension that is very close to the place of origin also of what had been, for example, the Vedas in India, etc., and that given the essential feudalism of Iran, so it's sort of aristocratic nature throughout most of its history in leadership and establishment, maintained some very important characteristics, provided that Persia also has some more sort of settled down sedentary development, also on the basis of naturally pre-Indo-European populations as well. That in this analysis of the various branches of the various Indo-European peoples and sort of Geist did water down, of course, some of, and also obviously just by time passing the primigenial kind of understanding of these peoples, and we'll have to really dig into proper Iranian history, the one of Persia, the one of the steppes, to get better what we're talking about. Because unfortunately, while there is something, if you study, I don't know, the Ossetian religion, you try to connect it with the Iranian one, and you kind of course, as we've done, look at the role of those peoples during the migration era, you connect them also with not just with the steppe, but this sort of broader Iranian branch. You can make all various connections with not just, of course, like the broader Indo-European world, but also between the steppes and Persia, which is actually one of the most interesting dynamics, as we've seen also with sagas, that gets a bit underplayed. In part because we intend the Achaemenids as already some sort of exotic Orientals that attack the core of Western identity. This is a bit of a modern secular thinking, right? If there were Aryans in a literal tribe called Aryans, during the Persian invasion of Greece, that this was from the Achaemenid side. And of course, we've seen also how powerful the Hellenic branch is. And so we're looking at similar peoples, at least in the broader cultural, say, primigenial cultural ethos, right, of Indo-European inspiration, with all the great distinctions that you can imagine having occurred across times and place. Now, Iran presents with a particularly strong character, in fact, of Indo-European tradition, right? Although when we compare it with the Vedas, we realize that the metaphysical elevation occurred in India through after the Indo-European conquest, was less intense, all right? Part of the reason why this is the case is that the peoples that took over Persia at some point from the north were less blessed by like a local civilization of some sort. You know that the Indo-Europeans infiltrated basically the entire Middle East. There is a massive influence throughout also Semitic peoples. We realize that there is always a blend, right, coming from these conquerors, also in areas that were prevalently not eventually even culturally hegemonized, unlike, in fact, Europe or India, and the same Persia instead. The Vedas do not even have much sort of archaeological relics to be studied on the basis of there is this massive religious tradition that survives in Hinduism, in Buddhism, at the origins of it, regardless of the heavy sort of impact that tectonic forces had, especially like in India, throughout all the eras, whichever conquer rule that was eventually swallowed by this telluric dimension. Persia remains a bit less developed originally, right? India at large manages to preserve this knowledge because in some parts it's sort of more stable, more sedentary, more power concentrated. Persia is more warlike, is more dynamic, and so it actually has a very marked way to in the European identity, especially through this idea of struggle, of fire, purification. At the same time, we start getting much of this Indo-European legacy from later times when it had gotten in part just through roots of meditative contemplation, As we'll see now, the Persian establishment maintained for most of its history, even part of the Islamic one, it's some very strong Indo-European legacy in beliefs, in action. This is a general discussion we should have for basically every Indo-European land, including Europe, that passes as, these were exotic peoples believe this stuff because we're closer to a more barbarian world. But Europe was in many ways actually the place where the Indo-European spirit reactivated more prepotently, more successfully in the history of mankind, while these other cycles were already winding down. We've seen it compared Rome with Persia, right? Rome always was the stronger power. From the early clashes with the Parthians to Constantinople, there is a great continuity, of course, of Persian civilization. We've seen it throughout really endless videos. Think about the Seljuks, think about other contexts where, in fact, there were other ethnos kind of, embracing even part of the same warlike mentality. But at the same time, Persia remains more contained in itself. It sort of fails. It's like the great moment, the high peak of its power is the Achaemenid era, where the Persians are really the universal empire, within which de facto the same Hellenic civilization also flourishes, at least in its later phase that we tend to celebrate the most, even though it more pertinently dates to the older Dorian of the Bronze Age origin. And we know of Persia mostly through the Zoroastrian tradition. So we could make all kind of digressions here, but we'll mostly stick to the latter because it's the most sort of documentable. Famously enough, central to Zoroastrianism is the Khvarenah, that is the attribute of kingly glory, that dominates a little bit. It's also the entire iconography of Persian power. We'll not specifically stick to the Achaemenids in symbolism, but of course that was a high point as far as also that archaeological production is concerned. Of course, things continue later on. As you know, eventually Zoroastrianism, like Buddhism and Christianity, is in many ways an approach to the great universal Catholic tradition that is, in this sense, criticized for having declined. At least people are criticized for having fallen short out of it, and so including the Khvarenah here, the heavenly glory, which is exactly the same, say, ideology that we widely discussed in the videos about the sacred royalty in the European text. So the virile, patrician nature of command that in Persia, in fact, has a markedly, in fact, militarized feudal character. It's actually the case for warlike speaking in all these cultures, but that in Persia assumes more a knightly form. There is even properly a representation of the Khvarenah as a shining halo that descends on a leader and makes him sacred. This is the miracle of transfiguration, also in Christianity. It is literally the Holy Ghost descending on the victorious general that by virtue transcends his human nature. The primary source of information on the Khvarenah comes from the Yashts, the younger Avesta's collection of 21 hymns dedicated to individual divinities. And here we're not to expound properly Zoroastrianism in all its complexity. If anything, we can make another video about that. But if anything, looking at what made the Achaemenid Empire great through the pneuma that the Indo-European origins had impressed on it. And there is probably a martial essence, as we were explaining, inherent in the worship of Ahura-Mazda that is far too familiar to warrant any special highlighting in this context compared to the other branches that we have covered. We could make the same observation regarding the venerable, pre-Islamic Persian adoration of fire, which incorporates the widely recognized teaching concerning Khvarenah, so the Gloria, the glory, In the same vein, this applies to the strict Iranian framework of paternal authority, to the Indo-European moral code centered on truth and loyalty, to the vision of the universe functioning as Rtam and Asha, meaning as cosmos, ritual, and structure order. That is all very similar, of course, to the Vedas. As we'll explain now, as you know, the same Mithras that becomes famous, we'll explain now also a bit the connections with Rome, but it had been basically part of the elevation of one of the Vedic Dioscuri, or at least the ones of the Iranian tradition, and after all was sharing a lot with the eastern branch, probably of the Indo-Europeans that the Persians and the Indians share. This is fundamental to the core of the Iranian worldview of, in fact, celestial prevalence of properly Apollonian force that connects, like the cosmos, according to Indo-European universal view. This force, once the initial multiplicity of those early conquering lineages had been unified and would give rise to the philosophical notion of the empire and to the related idea of the ruler embodying the king of kings, which is properly a deeper vision of sacred royalty. We have seen in other traditions that there is the race of the without kings, right? So the king of kings is properly not obeying anyone. The Achaemenid Empire came to be hierarchically structured in the way that we know, and so because of this capacity to fundamentally rule through a hell of a power that we saw, in fact, in all those videos about the auxiliaries of the Achaemenid army coming from all the subjected peoples that the Persian tradition embodied, right? Very often we will see it now. We see this, that the Achaemenid Empire is swinging in interpreting this scholarly interpretation, or this popular interpretation to some degree, from some kind of tolerant, multicultural, open system, which in a sense it was, but not in sort of the leftistic interpretation of the same, to some kind of more, in fact, autocratic, oppressive, and well, not properly barbaric force, which to an extent is also true, again, if you don't really depict these characteristics as specifically negative. You understand what they meant at the root. An enormous display of power that, especially when we talk the Persian wars, we tend to miss in its enormity and the striking success of its accomplishment, also way before, in fact, the Persian wars. And that constantly confronted itself with the same Iranian nomads of the steppes that in parts reinvigorated the same Achaemenid, that sense, feudal aristocratic ancestry of the Indo-European peoples of the north. And that, as we've seen also talking about the sagas, were considered as essentially, and also this for keeping to answer partially that series of videos that was asked about ethnicity in the Q&A of the ethnic divisions in antiquity, were properly represented above all the other non-Indo-European populations, subjected, at least properly from the center. Well, this is also interesting, that the Achaemenids placed themselves as properly the Persians, the Persian ethnos, together with this other Iranian peoples of the steppes, these warlike conquerors, and representing the rest of the sedentary world over which, in fact, the Achaemenid Empire was established, as subjects of properly a deterior kind, because they had not been able, first of all, to maintain their own freedom. They had been conquered, and this act of the conquest is what fuels also a great part of the Achaemenid confidence and self-awareness, we would say, that is that sort of de-varnished, so to say, by eventually the Persian Wars, and what we again conceive like, at least in a narrow way, the West to have been born like, and that in fact should instead be taken in much greater consideration. Now, a notable feature of the Iranian branch is that in its earliest phases, alongside the three social divisions aligning with the uppermost three Varnas among the Hindu Arya, namely the Brahmana, Kshatriya, and Vaishya, as we've seen among the Vedas, there was, in Iran, no separate category for the Shudra. In other words, the Shudra were essentially the fourth estate, right? So it's as if, right, a bit like in feudal Europe, probably the concept of slave did not quite exist per se. And there are different reasons for this that we'll try to explain. In fact, in the Avesta, the evidence for this extra sort of class is very slight, with the prevailing theory proposing, in fact, the tripartite divisions of younger Avestan and Vedic society sharing a Proto-Indo-European origin, despite, of course, the different etymology. But with, in fact, in the case of Iran, some, at least in Persia, in the Iranian plateau, less people to subject, because they would have been more informed by that warlike tradition of the steppes. They would have been slaves, telling the truth. And again, I will not enter the whole, issue of Cyrus proclaiming the fact that slavery did not exist. So it was by degrees viewing a society where ideally people were transfigured by this immense display of heavenly sovereignty. And that probably literally in the Iranian plateau did not dispose of a wide mass of slaves, as, instead the more sedentary populations in Mesopotamia could have even on their own before the Persian conquest. Indeed, again, the Iran was less socially stratified. At least they were more feudal, actually, so they were more hierarchical. But they would not necessarily. They would believe more of, in fact, of conquest of other peoples entirely abroad than some local exploitation of the population. This is also partially explaining the repeated Persian attempts at hegemonizing the Levant, which they historically failed time after time, due to the fact that they had a more warlike population in the Iranian plateau, but devoid of greater resources otherwise, and so much less combinable, for example, with the Roman world. It was also based on a surely witnessed, say, the preeminence of Rome in a hierarchical, feudal fashion towards other peoples, but it was also based on a much more sort of egalitarian level of power. It was not such a uniquely aristocratically led society like probably the feudal Persian one, right? The Romans had this body of properly cohesive citizens in arms that also a great part of Europe shared, with the Celts, the Germans as freemen, making the bulk of a more shared level of power that truly at that point is what, as Europeans, we maintained and helped preserving, in fact, this general sense of heavenly confidence, as opposed to different peoples like in Iran that definitely do not aspire for that nowadays, as it's very self-evident, right? I will skip this, but if you're interested in the tripartite division, right, social division of early Iran, you can study Émile Benveniste, the same Dumézil, that naturally were drawing from the heavily comparative Indo-European theory, looking at the Hellenists, the Italics, the Vedas, in fact, the same old Persians and early Indo-Europeans, including the same language, saying how frequent the presence of the lower element was. In other words, it seems that the Iranian plateau was less populated, of course, than other basins of demographic basins, such as the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, and that therefore the tectonic lower element was less represented. Of course, there would have actually been a fourth estate. To some degree, it's possible that the Iranians probably not even consider any other but themselves as freemen, because indeed also in the Vedas, technically the fourth estate was not they were not even people, right? And so that's very important. We'll see it in some videos about the traditional understanding of castes, right? But in India, you can't quite hide all the rest of the population in that sense as much as you can do with Iran. Looking at the parallel between the Vedas and Persia, we immediately notice a common reverence for truth, allegiance, and dignity. There is probably a greater sense of hierarchical power in Iran. As you know, in India, eventually the priestly class was considered superior, right? Even probably over the Kshatriya warriors. In Iran, really the feudal structure remains more consistent. It's also those bonds of honor pertaining to the military retinues, etc., are very much sort of praised. We know it very well from the Hellenic description of these populations. Furthermore, the archetype of the Median Iranian Atharvan, so the overseer of the holy fire, a bit like the Vestals in Rome, equivalent in numerous respects to the man of the primordial law, and we've seen how and why Rome would use the Vestals, and in this Median Iranian word would be the paoriyô thaêsha as well, corresponds directly to the Hindu archetype of the Atharvan and to the Brahmana in its primal incarnation, so the one preceding the essentially the split that occurred in different cultures between the sacerdotal and the probably the military dimension, right? That was instead the primogenial understanding of Uranian power shared by the Indo-Europeans. So this makes, again, this Eastern religions quite consistent, and in the case of Persia, even more focused around this primordial overseer of the holy fire as the divine lawgiver. That said, even amidst this elite-oriented spirituality, there is already a further decadence. Yes, the Persians maintain, again, this centrality more than the Vedas, that sort of stratified further this power at different levels, regardless of the purest doctrinal expounding of probably the metaphysical concept of this power. And we have the escalation to a full-blown crisis, and culminates with the emergence through the Saint Zarathustra of a reformed archetype akin to the one presented by the Buddha, who had, as you know, been part of the warrior caste and was basically saying, well, the system failed as it is, we have to come back to the original vision. And this is a concept akin to what Christianity did towards the Western Empire. But, you know, many people want to detach that from the Indo-European cycles because of the Semitic origins. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that the Catholic legacy of Christianity sublimated the greatest Indo-European revival in what is the medieval European civilization, and we will talk more about the specific characteristics of Catholicism, understood even if you don't understand it in the traditional sense, at least in the way we intend it more conventionally, that is today's, at least, Christian confession, which is the only possible one, by the way, and in fact predating the same Christianity as Catholicism, which is in fact the most correct concept of the same. So there are profitable, again, comparisons we could make between Buddha, Zarathustra, and Christ. In Zarathustra, it becomes evident that there was a counter-movement aimed at restoring the tenets of the foundational worship of the Iranian beliefs that in fact, are not otherwise documented in the most ancestral times, also because Persia, in fact, had not emerged as a radical empire, nor was per se just even the single most developed part of the same, and nor it was the case in areas that were actually diametrically opposite to the place of origin in the northeast of the Indo-European settlement, right? Of course, just like in all cycles, and looking at the partition of the quadripartition of the various ages, the foundational worship had begun fading into a more materialistic interpretation. We can witness it also for Rome. Again, Buddha basically criticizes the same approach in the Vedic legacy, and Zoroastrianism pushes back towards a cleaner and less material version, albeit one that across several dimensions carried traces of particular moralism, meaning that by the time we get to know about the Zoroastrian doctrine, we can already spot those cases of more contemplative, sort of more posed approach to the older origin. Also, again, Persia, throughout the various dynasties that ruled over it, sort of diluted its own spirit. It was, the Achaemenid Empire was conquered by Alexander to begin with. Then there were other peoples who were less successful, such as the Arsacids dynasty. These were basically same Iranian peoples from the northern steppes. The Paoriyô, again, made also some videos about Parthian warfare. The Sasanian dynasty in particular revived, especially collected the legacy of the Achaemenid Empire, was very powerful in that sense, probably reactivated some of that belief, of that ideology that at this point was also heavily Zoroastrian in nature. And nevertheless, in times where people we're talking centuries after Christ, had already, as we've seen in the West, pretty much elsewhere, abandoned basically the hope that they could be saved by their own action, therefore really failing to, of course, uphold the standards that had been the one of the kings of kings. In particular, also with Rome that had de facto hegemonized the entire moral power of Western Eurasia, and so that also Persia fundamentally gravitated around at that point. Very different from Achaemenid times. This especially important is the myth recounted in the Yashna in the Bundahesh, claiming that Zarathustra was born within the Arian Vaia, that is to say, the ancient northern territory, often associated with, in fact, this heights and connection with the light. Right, there is all the notion of the hyperboreal origin of the ultimate divine race that many millennia before Christ would have eventually spread from the north and from the west. There's also the Atlantean, origin that we'll look at. That is definitely present in many of these concepts. After all, the fact of the Indo-Europeans themselves had largely spread at that point from the East, from the west into Iran. The Zoroastrian tradition portrays the Arian Vaia as the seed of the race of the Ari. So obviously, Iran meaning Arian, right? So noble and connected with primal glory and identity. Moreover, this was the site of probably a golden age conceived together with the sovereign glory. In the Avesta, Arian Vaia is the homeland of the early Iranians and the place where Zarathustra himself allegedly received the religion from Ahura-Mazda. So there is naturally a metaphysical sort of essence of Zarathustra himself at some point is associated with the same Ahura-Mazda, and that therefore transcends like more specific time and place, unless again we want to prehistorically traced like a specific origin in geographical terms and temporal ones. Now, the important is that the earliest mentions of the Arian Vaia are found in the Avesta, particularly in the Vendidad and several of the Yashts. And in the latter, the Arian Vaia is most prominently named in the Abban Yasht as the place where both Ahura-Mazda and Zarathustra sacrificed to Anahita. This is fascinating because it shows how sort of primigenially old the Iranian tradition actually was and conceived this ancestral homeland. It was there that Zarathustra initially proclaimed his teachings, as well as they were here passed down to, and in fact, there is always a debate also about the historicity of Zarathustra, as we want to properly appreciate a specific exact time frame over his existence, right? Because basically we're talking 7th, 6th century BC, according to some scholars. Others even place him between the mid-second millennium, the first millennium BC, right? 1500, 1000 BC. This is not per se too important. I mean, it would be important to know because, of course, Zoroastrianism was there. Also in Achaemenid times, there was surely this broader, even freshness of these quite, as we've seen, ancestrally unspoiled beliefs, and it would be interesting in that sense to measure the expansion of the Achaemenid Empire through such pure divine inspiration. Some scholars base their date reconstruction on the Proto-Indo-Iranian language and Proto-Indo-Iranian religion, while others use internal evidence as well, but it's complicated. There are consonances, by the way, between Zarathustra and other classical figures. For example, the Hermes, or specifically the Egyptian Hermes, as of course the comparison is with the Hellenic one, but that had comparable functions. There are also other personages that could assert to this archetype, and that point to toward a more specifically exoteric current than toward one individual per se, which is also understandable if we, in fact, appreciate how old Zoroastrianism could practically be and how sort of divinely shrouded this figure is, even compared to Buddha, that was instead meant to have sprung properly from a more specific social connotation. There is a more sort of conventional humanization. It was the beginning of the Enlightened. Zarathustra is instead at some point basically overlapping with God himself. It's not like Buddhism does not have similar things, but it's slightly different, and aside from the later sort of alterations and proliferation of further Buddhist interpretations, things are to be understood in a slightly different fashion. This due to the aforementioned continuity in a broader sort of feudal knightly activity. It's not like India did not have some of that. As a matter of fact, we studied ancient medieval Indian warfare, and there's probably a very underestimated cavalry capacity. Nevertheless, again, there are forces that also act in parallel with that are sort of more demonic, right? In Iran, there is, if anything, a greater feudal continuity, and so Zarathustra may have been idealized into some greater divine authority that would be constantly regenerated as much as through the various waves of from the steps that kept reinforcing that kind of identity throughout the millennia. As you know, Persia will remain essentially culturally hegemonic, even on some, for example, Mesopotamia. Think about at the time of the Abbasids, and more or less even other non-Indo-European peoples that came to rule over them, like the Turks or the Mongols, were heavily Persified later on. We've seen it in many medieval warfare videos. In any case, again, the general understanding of Zarathustra as this properly hermetic tradition renders the term potentially applied to various figures across separate eras who channeled that very current. It would be interesting to observe whether the historicity of any of these, but it's more the transcendental concept that matters. At least the so-called historical Zarathustra, that was in fact humanized, if anything, in that sort of more moralizing dimension through which these texts come to be spread in later eras, is the one most commonly discussed, and it ought to be viewed, however, as a concrete expression of the same previous current, to some extent as the embodiment of the Hyperborean god, from which derives also the motive of his nativity, exactly at the primal hub, just Apollo, and therefore the divinity of the absoluteness of this figure is readily available. So this would occur during a period that roughly aligns with the early, let's say, the earliest Indo-European traditional memories of the primal seas of God. And it's interesting in this sense to parallel it also with Buddha, considering the possibility also within the Vedas of that kind of partial, absoluteness and divinity stemming from much older traditions that unfortunately are basically irremediably lost for reconstruction. Now, especially noteworthy is that Zarathustra's confrontation with the deity of obscurity is incredibly strong, as much as in other Indo-European traditions that were, in a sense, spoiled by, in fact, greater chthonic substrata. This is true a bit for everyone, but there is a dualistic tendency that will be also embraced by other currents like Manichaeism, for example, that would spread far and wide also in the Persian Empire, as a matter of fact. So this is yet another degenerative tendency of believing that there is an opposite force that surely is present in the concept of Indo-European transfiguration, because you cannot transfigure if you don't tame the lowest elements, the darkest forces of the universe, in order to reunite everything to the one. But this eventually shipwrecks towards some sort of dualistic opposition of a principle of light, one of darkness, that almost counterbalance one another. In Zoroastrian tradition, the deity of obscurity is, of course, a feminine demon, so incarnating the diametrically opposite essence of the virile hero and his Iranian portents, during which that he fights with, and during which he calls upon for his own aid in the battle, exactly that flow, the Daita flow from the Arian Vaia. Literally, this is from the Vendit 19.2. And interestingly enough, in the Vendidat, this figure, the Nasui, is the female Zoroastrian demon of corpse matter, who takes the form of a fly and is the manifestation of decay and contamination, which immediately, as you understand, connects with the rite of purification through the sacred fire. And of course, it's a metaphor, but not quite so, because, as you know, incarnation is a product of the fall. And so it is synonym with becoming, as opposed to Uranian perfection of perennialism. In this sense, Nasu, as a also potent feminine force, appears in various texts within the Avesta, notably what we just mentioned, the Vendidat, as this text gives particular focus to demons, right? Purification rituals and the disposal of corpses, property, and other dead matter. I explained also in practice what is the somatic destiny of those souls that do not surpass the second death, right? The second trial, second judgment, and so are, say, bound to this degenerate in the absence of a broader savior into themselves, eventually disappearing, roaming the world for a while, but then disappearing. Actually, the somatic soul is meant to go back to the soul of the ancestors. That is an underworld, like the manes, the mania. That is also, in fact, in Latin religion, a feminine dimension. The second soul properly roams the land and eventually disappears after a while. Naso is commonly considered the greatest polluter of Ahura-Mazda's world. So in other words, the degenerative essence of a fallen nature that crushes the world further in its fall. In terms of tangible events, accounts describe numerous fierce conflicts waged by Zarathustra against the erstwhile Mazdian priestly order as well. This is particularly interesting because it parallels definitely with Buddha and with the notion that the warrior caste, so the one of the sacred ruler, had been at some point throughout also this Iranian tradition prevailed or had stolen practically the priestly function away from the warriors, right? And so the Zoroastrian, just like in Buddhism, actually far from being like a religion of peace, it is properly one of holy war. And Zoroastrianism is a revindication of such priestly order for the leaders properly of the cult. This is interesting because already in the Achaemenid Empire there was a tension between the king and the priestly order. Certain writings depict those priests as agents of the Deva, meaning the forces antagonistic to the light deity, right? Or at least minor ones that had to be instead subsumed by the greater authority. This detail indicates an ensuing degradation within that order anyway, and so just like in Buddhism, the idea that there was a primogenial tradition that essentially these peoples had failed to hold up to, and therefore requiring a reformation, a radical spiritual rebooting. The persistence across the entirety of the Iranian heritage, whose overarching tone was fundamentally Indo-European and monarchical, especially as we understand from also the Achaemenid tradition, but likely also before, of a conflict stemming from the priestly order's bid for dominance, is evidenced by the bid of the priest Gaumata, who at one juncture sought to seize the ultimate authority and establish a theocracy of some sort. This aspect is fascinating because it resonates with the investiture controversy historically, with the affirmation of Christianity, separation of church and state, at the beginning of Common Era. It has obviously to be understood also in metaphorical terms because the two powers were always to a degree distinct. I mean, if you think about societal organization in general, like you can think of a divine origin, but of, as we'll see now, also some figures that make it all by themselves, just like Mithras, literally from a stone to the sun. In any case, when we look at the Persian tradition, Gaumata here, as an usurper of, monarchical, in the sense, a sacred ruler authority, as a priest, was in fact a magus, just as the magi in the Christian tradition, but they're exactly from that, and that they have an interesting history. And in any case, Gaumata impersonated Bardiya, the brother of Cambyses II, seizing the throne in 522 BC until slain by Darius I. So this is an heroic affirmation again of sacred royalty on this priestly usurpation of power, as detailed, by the way, in the Beistun inscription carved 330 feet up a cliff in Kermanshah province. And this inscription is a multilingual Achaemenid royal one, a large rock relief on a cliff in western Iran. Right. Persian annals document this as the sole such endeavor, by the way. It's an instance of attempted usurpation of monarchic power by this priestly function of the monarch, as at least the priests could condition the king as they existed as, however, subordinated to that power hierarchy, and we'll talk more about this in other videos. This is a foundational motive, also relatively recent one, historically speaking, that is renewed in strength upon encountering, in fact, the corrupt customary structures of neighboring cultures that it really represent a reaction to, in fact, a general decadence of all these, also in the European culture throughout that era. Basically, only Rome will fully rise to some full splendor in that regard. But as we know, in Mitraism, there is partially something like that, which also will, in fact, resonate with Rome later on. Mitraism manifests a fresh, heroic phase grounded in a defined initiatory foundation. Right? It basically shows like the possibility of divine attainment of, in fact, the lowest of all creatures, a stone, right? So the most courageously fallen dimension of the cosmos. Mithras is a sun god hero who triumphs over the earthly bull, an age-old deity of the radiant, either akin to Indra and even to the Hindu Mithras, as a matter of fact, because it, as we were saying before, it stems from that. Standing apart as a figure unentangled from the females or divinities that erotically or ecstatically flank the deities of Syria, for example, and the waning Egyptian pantheon in an aphrodisiac or Dionysiac manner. This is important because it's a reaffirmation of the northern Iranian essence in its combative manifestation. Thus, veritably a reaction to the general surrounding. I mean, if you especially look at it from a Persian dimension, like at least the Western world where they were advancing, dominating, was the most insidiously fallen in that regard. The Levant had already witnessed the prevalence of the feminine and the fall, in fact, of the greater virile manifestation of power. Mithras is part of the Vedic Dioscuri, so he basically embodies, like with Hercules, the full attainment of divinity by the victorious warrior. We all know of Mithras mostly because of the role that it had in later Roman history, if anything. The Romans had their own Dioscuri from the Indo-European tradition themselves. There are two manifestations of the Roman Dioscuri that are all tied with the typical equestrian symbolism and affirmation of victory, especially also connected to this sort of salvation from the waters that the same Dioscuri manifests from, which partly echoes the stone connection with Mithras. The tauroctony, typical of Mithraic iconography, especially in the West, symbolizes the release of the cosmic forces for renewal. In other words, it's like slaying the dragon, like the bull being a heavily tonic animal, but also pretty strong one. Think about the tauromachy of the Minoans, and so how in that sort of Pelasgian, feminine-dominated society that represented this untamed force of nature that, however, was to be reswallowed by the Great Mother, right? That the Indo-Europeans instead tamed and possessed. And so that's what Mithras actually does. He picks this chthonic victim and sacrifices it as the best, by the way, of the chthonic dimension to gain its power and to rise itself, to increase itself, having naturally conquered this force himself. The imagery depicts Mithras killing the bull, hence the name tauroctony after the Hellenic word tauroctonos, bull killing, which actually resonates with the Roman suevotaurilia, right? That is depicted pretty much all over Roman iconography, and is in fact of Indo-European origin. People will say, well, the Taurobolium was connected with the cult of Kubala. That's another thing. And the same in say, Pelasgian Great Mother Earth kind of sacrifices were, of course, of the same nature, because the same mother was meant to let's say, acquire control over this children, re-swallowing them. So this was equally a tribute to the same deity. The Indo-European tradition, the Roman Soviet Aurelia, had the same set kind of purpose of the sacrifice to the gods that you find also in the Iranian world, and in fact resonating with Mitraism. And in fact, again, the ancestral myth of the Dioscuri and the ultimate, I will make a video about that, the ultimate meaning of this divine twins is connected with the perennial and the non-perennial. It's a bit like Romulus himself, that also sacrifices his own brother, achieving divinity himself. There is also another interesting aspect, that is, Mithras was equated in the Iranian tradition not merely with the Hyperborean Apollo, the deity of the Golden Age, but furthermore with Prometheus. Right? This is yet another interesting aspect of the same, because this is an association hinting at the radiant elevation to which the Titan blends into a godhead representing the elementary spirituality. Why? Because after all, the Titan is just a god who failed, right? And Prometheus, in this sense, is just like Prometheus also fails, but is eventually liberated according to the myth. Those are also, again, it's very difficult to talk mythology without like a comparative and sort of stratified also philological reference to who or when expressed this. But the notion being, and we will see it now also with an incoming video about the sacred notion of properly of the same mythology and its dual meaning, that in a moment of fall in which mankind, say humanity, lives in fact in this condition of misery, there can be one hero elevating from literally zero that manages to challenge the same god and rise to be the same. This is what Mithras in many ways really is, because again, he, as we'll see now, emerges from a stone only. And so this adds yet another layer to the Mitraic role within the broader Iranian religion that naturally encompasses, we've seen, properly a deity, a sense of sacred royalty, of lineage, some stratified tradition of a son, right, and father and Holy Ghost at the same time, as a reaction to the loss of standards. And Mithras, in a sense, was the heroic, the Herculean figure that, in fact, emerges from a stone, as we explained. And so he has a different origin. It's more exemplificative of what can be done in practice, at least maintaining perennial sense of what kind of what the hero can achieve. And he is also symbolically equipped with the dual emblem of the sword and illumination, the torch. Once again, the Promethean symbolism, so probably a man-made instrument, but also a light to wield this weapon that is naturally the providential vision that can mold the world in his own image. Mithras is depicted as being born from a rock known as Petra Genetrix in Latin. Already in his youth he held a dagger and a torch, a bit like Hercules, that immediately, as he was still in the cradle, chokes probably the snake sent by Hera as well, and so opens the way, opens the path, and as a presage of divine victory. And so in the esoteric Irano-Roman mythology and Mithraism, the Petra Genetrix, so the mother rock, the rock that gave birth, is the rock from which the same Mithras was born. exemplifying that every part of creation is endowed with the potential to attain divinity again. This owes a parallel to the element found in the Titan legend. It is worth mentioning the depiction. It is also from a telluric here, most evident mineral extraction. Mentioning the depictions of Mithras divesting the tree to fashion his attire, followed by his engagement in combat against the sun, which he overcomes prior to forming an alliance with the same and virtually merging into that. All right. So the tree symbolism is complex. We've never talked about this, but if you're familiar with Fraser and the study of the Rex Nemorensis, you know what it is. It's basically the same tree of the Garden of Eden that Adam fails to make his own and to replenish with his own fruit as God himself, and that instead is reinforced also in the medieval esoteric tradition of the emperors that have basically hanged their swords on the tree in the context of their temporary obscuration, as they will have to come to save the world in the end time themselves. So Mithras is connected with that too. The combative organization of the Mitraic esoteric hierarchy is likewise reasonably familiar. You can find it different sources. In iconography, the 7 grades of Mitraic initiation were the Corax, Nymphus, Miles, Leo, Perses, Heliodromus, and Pater. So you pass from the lowest, in fact, to the more Chthonic to the highest, the more Apollonian. Vertically structured to imitate the soul's journey through the planetary spheres themselves and different levels, probably of incarnation, and towards divinity. Each grade represented a step along the path to spiritual enlightenment and union with God. And each member must ascend a cosmological ladder of enlightenment by progressing through 7 grades that are also numerologically typical of the initiation. Everybody sort of knows of this kind of initiatic cults, and basically the same Christianity is one. So nothing strange. It's all part of the same great Catholic tradition. There is a rejection of terrestrial elements, however, that still defines Mitraism. In fact, contrary to the perspectives held by devotees of more Chthonic influences like Serapis and Isis and their salvific and sort of more, in this sense, passive sort of projections on the faithful, placed the dwelling of the emancipated souls not amidst the earth's underbelly, but amid the realms of untainted celestial light. Mitraism is an Apollonian light. At some point, not even Nietzsche understood that Mithras was not a sort of debauched oriental deity that was polluting the West. It was just a reinvigoration of the Dioscuri and their meaning in a later Roman context. It was also very, very connected with military cults, and again, this notion that you can make it into divinity through your own standards. And this is very interesting because, as you know, Mitraism competed at a point with Christianity, so in a time in which it was believed that you couldn't make it into heaven alone anymore, largely. And it's interesting that the Mediterranean at large maintained instead for centuries still this possibility, and especially by those who wielded the Imperium. There is a very also interesting progression through the firmament here with the transit of the, spiritual journey through this assorted celestial bodies, the various heavens that purge the soul of worldly attachments and emotional excesses. Right. For example, there are some purifications of fire and cremations within burial customs. The Iranians were not fully into the process, right? And in part, this is not much an influence as we've seen from Chthonic forces within Persia that surely would have been part of the reason why cremation was gradually abandoned, but because, in fact, it was believed that the body would defile the holiness of fire. And this was seen as, it's actually almost an excuse, but still indicative, of course, of the fact that these bodies had not belonged to people able to make it into heaven, and that therefore did not have to contaminate fire. So that's the measure of the degeneration, but that still stems from a very specific Indo-European belief. Very interesting are the Mitraic rites and initiations, right? As much as the fact that these were nearly universally barred from female presence, which is quite meaningful in the patriarchal, say, Iranian meaning of in the European religion. The predominant military influence in Mitraism makes female participation unlikely, as well as evidenced by the absence of women in inscriptions and the cult's secretive, male-only structure. And historians, including Command and Richard Gordon, have concluded that the cult was for men only, and the practice of depicting the god slaying the bull seems to be specific as well to Roman Mitraism, as this was further recovering the Zoroastrianism, and also the military nature of the meaning within, in fact, the Roman army itself, that had always maintained this kind of connection with even such sacrifices. And so Mitraism, in its character of fellowship, also brothers in arms and so on, in which the notions of hierarchy and brotherhood coexisted, was not merely an Eastern influence of within a Roman Empire that did not know these meanings or symbolism, was not an Eastern fashion of some sort. It stood out as an important syncresis, and in sharp contrast to the indiscriminate emotional bonds typical of, in fact, the Mediterranean world at a time by which these various cults were clashing against one another. And hence also the opposition to Christianity, right, that was initially considered by the Romans, in fact, the measure of, okay, like, it's not true that we can't make it into heaven by ourselves, that the emperor is not actually God, regardless of how the Romans had considered the divs differently from the deus. It's a slight difference of a deification after that, but because Christianity, especially before it was legalized, was mostly like a mass phenomenon within, in fact, the lower strata of the population, and therefore contaminated by those elements, pathos, and in fact, distance from the detachment. Also, Stoicism had merit, for example, alignment with, the distance from emotions of that was typical of the Iranian cults in the European establishment. The bond among Mitraic adepts, adopting the title of soldiers because it was indeed intended as a psychomachia at least, but actually being practiced by brotherhoods of warriors, just like in ancient Persia was done within those feudal milieu, constituted that lucid, intensely personal kind, feasible only between fighters, in fact, united in a shared campaign, as opposed to other forms of mystical abandonment to a simple, acceptation of, let's say, symbolic actions. In fact, what is interesting, even about early Christianity, is that, for example, the concept of caritas is mostly diluted from the original, in fact, Roman one. This was initially a loving devotion, in fact, connected with a genetic ancestry of a filial piety, just like the pietas itself, right? and that mostly applied to, however, a feminine dimension. And there are different stories about this, and in that myth, in original myth, it is still the feminine element that basically supports the virile principle in a subordinated fashion, right? So you understand how well even the Christians practiced in the correct way, and this was probably also the purpose of the church towards the empire, right? So it's not like it really changed, but in late antiquity, this had, among the masses, the fourth estators, of course, taken the manifestation of some sort of socialism, almost a welfare element. And then, of course, the proper Catholic Christian meaning remained intact also in later times. And that contrasted, in fact, with the virility of the Mitraic self-sacrifice, if anything, that had to be nurtured by others in order for achieving collective salvation. So especially subordinated the female elements that were not part, as we've seen, of the Mitraic cult. And this very character of warrior brotherhoods was already part of the other Indo-European world. Like the Romans had this among the same legions, regardless of, again, of the more secular view of the same. It had been even more prompt in archaic Rome, as we've seen in multiple videos. This was true among the Germans with their Gefolgschaft, right? So it's interesting, again, that Mitraism surfaced from a Persian origin in late antiquity, blending with this other tradition. In some facets, the same Mitraism could be misinterpreted. There is, for example, a salvific idea of Mithras that some communities decline themselves in this more passive way, as they had to be saved by this Lord, right? In some other sense, he was understood as a mediator, so in the correct sense of the eternally rising as the king of the living, right? Battling and elevating themselves in a space far from man and God. You understand how the various devotional practices could, of course, apply to the same idea, depending on which kind of social role you really had. And it's relevant to observe the resurgence of this specific idea. Consider that the same Roman society was becoming ever more lordly or oligarchic in late Roman times, so not becoming feudal, but coming closer, also in the eastern part of the empire, to some Persian dimension that was very influential, in fact, also the Byzantine court and so on. This will be evident up to, in fact, very late in time, and of course, warfare produces hybrid synchrosis between enemies. And the same is true, in fact, as far as the idea of Roman Catholic power affected Persia, and this same vision of the cult. Remembering, again, that the Dioscuri, that Mithras was essentially already there in the Roman world, in others here around. Mitraism naturally was understood at some point as possibly providing with an alternative trajectory to the Latin West, especially, as opposed to the path allegedly embodied by Christianity, that instead managed to successfully uphold those military meanings ever since St. Paul in the Militia Christi, but we've seen it also throughout probably the Christianization of the empire, the fact that Christianity had actually always backed the empire and the military. There was replete with Christians who were excellent soldiers. There's not even an instance where anybody was lamenting, say, being martyrized, for example, for not shedding blood. And even when there is that you can't bring this word in a broader sense, this is something that, in fact, takes a more radical extremization, not a condemnation of the function of earthly power per se, right? it's this absolute alienation, like a Buddhistic idea of complete detachment from the world in order to attain the ultimate goal. But that point transcends the military profession itself, and this continues also in other times in history, as opposed to, say, if you look at a contemplative lifestyle, for example, as a ultimate decision of pursuit after a life dedicated to warfare. Many medieval knights also carry out that, because action and contemplation are necessary to obtain the highest result. Christianity triumphed instead, and we could make videos explaining how or why that is the case. It's unlikely that things would have gone differently, especially, I don't know, in the much cited instance of Julian and so on. In any case, when you look at Mitraism, you see an importantly esoteric resurgence of a military cult tied to the solar symbolism. Emperor Julian was initiated into the mysteries of Mitraism during his pre-Christian revival. We're in the 4th century, and again at that point not much could really be done. The same henotheism pursued by Julian entailed, in any case, the idea of lording over the lower elements. If these were maintained as low, and instead they end up triumphing, so that there is something deep about the Catholic legacy that Christianity manages to uphold. You would think that everything would sort of fragment into further cults of visions. Instead, Christianity, especially in the West, reachieves Catholicism in its primal form. Julian's writings and the cult's persistence among the elites reveal how widespread Mitraism was, but not to the overall degree that was necessary. And Catholicism at that point, Christianity did not bar, by the way, militarism from the picture. On the contrary, there was an increasing support towards the empire, especially with Ambrose of Milan at the end of the 4th century. So a full acceptation of the militarization of Christianity, also in earthly terms. Did the Iranian tradition live on during the Middle Ages, as in the case of medieval Ghibellinism? Well, it's complicated. If anything, we'll see it with more calm in a dedicated video. Following the Islamic conquest of the domain once held by the ancient Iranian, say Persian culture, naturally elements tied to the prior legacy found ways to resurface, right? Persia is tendentially a more, let's say, esoteric land. Think about Shia Muslims. When you look at even the Safavid dynasty, 1501-1722, you still realize that in Imamism, with Shah Ismail I proclaiming the 12-verse Shiism as the official religion at the beginning of his rule, that had already, again, it was already similar. Of course, it was part of the Shia current already, but it was sort of the most mystical, sort of the most esoteric element. And it was a rally banner to unify historically, just also the broader Shia movement, this Persian power against the Sunni rivals, coming to infiltrate even, for example, the Al-Mamun Caliphate, that could, at that point, turn the tide in favor of Shia. The Fatimids of Egypt also did so, but not, at least not overwhelming directly because of the Persian influence, but it was still always there. You know that the 12-verse Shiism revolves around the concept of a concealed guide, which is the Imam who, following an interval of absence known as Gaiba, shall return to defeat injustice and restore the golden age on earth, which sounds very much like the doctrine of, Catholic transcendence and return of the afterlife. There is something, of course, almost messianic in this, but it's more transcendental than most. In fact, the most flattened Sunni vision of this that is very much more anchored to the secular, to the earthly dimension. This is important because there is not caliph here, and the imam is more like of a spiritual guide that incarnates that power of conditions. I mean, Persia will always remain sort of a secondary power around, in spite of its hegemonizing capacities. Not much of a state compared to, for example, the Mesopotamian power. The same Persian power in antiquity had tried essentially to escape its provincial backwaters by hegemonizing Mesopotamia. This was true at the time of the Sasanians, but also the time of the Achaemenids, right? But at the same time, this capacity of reviving, right, of resurfacing a transcendental power is proper of Persia for a long time. Naturally, things were gotten diluted, right? The same eras of the Imam's occultation extends up to an indefinite moment, and so the notion that somebody can do something in the meanwhile is, of course, flattening the possibilities of humanity outside of this guidance. There's a bit of Mitraism there, right? So the idea that somebody has already done it for you, you understand, it's a bit like the Christian concept as well. But that's how also the Indo-European substrata had already passed towards the end of time. I mean, it's just like, I don't know, in the Germanic world, there wasn't much of the idea anymore that you could save yourself by yourself. And there is something grandiose about Persian royalty and this sense broader grandeur and chivalric ethos, knightly exploit, heroism, championship, etc. that echoes that transcendental power. All right. The Zoroastrian Saushant is the echoing the 12-verse Shiism. He would be the final savior who will rise the dead for judgment and establish eternal good. This parallels also the Shia Imam Mahdi, in fact the same hidden 12th Imam who will reappear to bring justice and peace. In etymologically speaking, the term Saushant derives from an active participle of the future stem of the verbal root su-sau, which itself comes from the Proto-Indo-European root kev, to swell, right? And over time, so it's a sort of parallel of Augustine, of Sebastos. It's the idea that there's something that augments itself and expands up to cover the world as a universal power. And the verbal root acquired from this etymology, the extended meanings to be of use, profit, advantage, and to create profit, use, advantage to further, right? So this speaks of course, a transcendental redemption, right? And represents, of course, the long-standing Indo-European Iranian motive of the Saushant. Much could be added in terms of how much these ideas were upheld. Naturally, they lived within, again, a very different sort of Islamic worldview, and the general times, of course, speak of the general misery of the Iranian people in the world, quite castigated by Western power, as always was the case, as a matter of fact. However, we also appreciate the continuation of these beliefs, just as much you could find them in the West, were we to be a bit more honest about the origins of most of our ideals. This is very important, and if anything, this series is dedicated to such analysis. Naturally, things could be even more in-depth analyzed. We're here to offer as much let's say in-depth in different videos as we can. Unfortunately, this year, differently from the last couple, did not witness a particularly large amount of views in this period. This was normally the moment in which the content erupted in a way or another, and this is instead not what practically occurred. in these very weeks. So God knows how or why this is the case. What is YouTube up to in general? It seems to me that probably things are going south to a degree that is irremediable. Maybe for the channel, maybe for YouTube itself, I don't know. But we must think something, because I don't think this is sustainable anymore. Sometimes you have afterthoughts on the basis of, some general issues in things that happen, right? Quite simply in life that bring you down, whatever. But the point is maintaining an important degree of awareness and not giving up. So I don't know. Lots of things change over the years quite quickly. It's as if time passed too fast, but at the same time you realize that so much happens in between it. It's barely controllable. And we have all to fight with everything to a degree. I don't know how inspiring these videos are. I just know that this stuff helped me at some point in my life when I wanted to find new meaning in things. And to some element, this is disconcerting because, of course, the meaning is also a dark one if you think about how everything ends. So enjoy this stuff. Try to use it in your life, but also don't be too harsh with yourself, because at some point, you should be, but sometimes we're not ready as humans to be. So we need a bit of training, right? And some strong some stronger sort of backbone to handle it. We try. With Schwerpunkt, I've tried to do this. I've grown with this. I don't know how far it can go further, but I think we must go on, and we'll see what happens, because there is still a potential, a possibility behind this that we should absolutely take into consideration. Tell me what you think about this, because very often I don't have a clue about the whole situation. Sometimes it's hard to go on. And people like drama. They say, oh my God, you give up, or whatever. No, I never said that. In fact, I've always acted as if this was not the case. But there were moments in which it was hard. Not because of the channel, but because of things that happen in life. And so sometimes you never know. Sometimes you would just like to say why to certain things. Other times you accept it on the basis of the fact that there is seemingly no alternative but fixing the issue. So that's, if anything, the guiding force behind this all. And I think that it's all more understandable the more sort of we go on, the more we can achieve and attain in the process. But also the end game is important, and at some point you have to reflect upon it, really. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.